Our next speaker is recognized as one of the world's foremost advocates for art preservation. What started as curiosity about the survival of great works of art during the devastation of World War II turned into a passion and a best-selling book titled The Monuments Men. In 2007, he founded the Monuments Men and Women Foundation for the Preservation of Art. He is also the founder of Gemini Exploration, an oil and gas company, in addition to being a very competitive tennis player. He has served on various not-for-profit boards, including the National World War II Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Edsel.
Thank you very much to our National Commander, Jim LeCourcier. I also want to express my appreciation to friends Mario Marquez, Cole Lyle, and Matthew Schumann for this great honor to be here speaking with you today. Seeing that movie trailer, which I want to thank Columbia Pictures for making available, stirs many memories of monuments men and women who I met along the way, all friends and Americans like you, who proudly serve their country. I'd like to tell you about one of them that changed the trajectory of my life. In 2006, at the beginning of my journey to locate and interview all the living monuments men and women, I was in Williamstown, Massachusetts to meet Monuments Officer Lane S. Faison Jr., a legendary professor of art at Williams College and the son of Brigadier General Sampson Faison, United States Army. Gordon, one of Lane's 4 sons, had discouraged me from making the trip. He told me, "My father's 98 years old. He sleeps most of the day. His memory's failing. I really think you're wasting your time." But I told him it would be a great honor of mine to be able to just sit with him, if nothing else. So I made the trip. By war's end, Lane had been one of 3 officers of the OSS tasked with interrogating war criminals, gathering evidence of the Nazi looting operation for the Nuremberg trials, and preparing for the restitution of millions of stolen works of art. Lane greeted me from his recliner at the assisted living residence where he was staying, dressed as if he was headed out for a late autumn walk. Gordon watched the first awkward moments, and boy, were they ever awkward. I was nervous, and it showed. Lane mumbled a few questions at first before I realized he was interrogating me. He wanted to determine why in the world I was interested in something he'd done so long ago. So I got up from my chair, I knelt down beside him, and I showed him my first book, Rescuing Da Vinci, a photographic telling of these wartime events. Opening the book to a photo of him in 1945, a twinkle in his eye emerged. He took the book from me, and he began turning the pages, commenting on officers he'd served with, hiding places he'd inspected, and stolen works of art that he'd held in his hand. Several images had captions that read, "Unidentified American Soldier." Lane knew their names and ranks. Then he started sharing stories. 4 hours passed. We were both exhausted. His son was in disbelief that his father had stayed awake and all these memories that he recalled. As I approached his recliner to thank him, Lane gripped my hand and pulled me right up to his face and said, "I've been waiting to meet you all my life." I was stunned. I was in disbelief. I couldn't imagine what in the world he was trying to say to me, but as the days passed, I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to tell their story. He wanted me to be their messenger. Ten days later, I received a phone call from one of my colleagues informing me that Lane had died, and it was Veterans Day. I attended his memorial service a few weeks later, where I met his 4 sons. And I said, "What in the world happened? Your father was in good shape when I left." And they said he was, in fact. But the day after you left, he called all 4 of us and he said, "Say your goodbyes. I'm ready to go." And he fell into a coma and died days later. Lane prearranged for these words to be carved on his gravestone. Ars longa vita brevis. Life is short, the arts are forever. Now, not without a sense of humor, for those that happened to walk behind the gravestone, he added one word on the back: boo. Like other World War II veterans, Lane spent his life downplaying his sacrifices and achievements. So did my father, Ray Edsel, who served with the 2nd Marine Division on Saipan, Okinawa, and at Nagasaki, places we as children occasionally heard about, never discussed. A child of the Depression, raised in the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma, he knew hardship, yet he was a lifelong optimist. He believed in America, and he made sure that his children did too. Late in life, he shared his wartime experiences with us. He watched with great pride as I changed the trajectory of my life from a business career to a life of public service as an author, speaker, and messenger. Monuments Man Lieutenant Commander Lane S. Faison Jr. was the catalyst. Fate tapped me on the shoulder a second time in 2015 when I received a letter from the nephew of Captain Walter Hutchhausen, one of 2 monuments men killed in action. It contained surprising news. Frida van Schaik, a Dutch teenager who during the war took care of Hutchhausen's grave, perhaps the last civilian to see him before he was killed in action, was alive and living in the south of London. A photograph of her fell from the letter. I felt duty-bound to go and meet her. She and I met at her home on Memorial Day in 2016. I learned that Frida and her family had hidden Jews in downed Allied air crews during German occupation, and that they developed many friendships with American soldiers, including Captain Hutchhausen, during the 5 months that 9th Army waited in the harsh winter, preparing for the final drive on Berlin. As we sat in the breakfast room table looking over her photos of the liberation of South Limburg in the Netherlands, Frida asked if I'd been to the U.S. military cemetery in Margraten. I assured her I had. I said, "I've been there several times." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes, I'm very sure. I have been there." "So you know about the grave adoption program?" And I said, "The what?" And she said, "The grave adoption program." And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Well, I wasn't familiar with it then, but after 8 years of research, I am now. My new book, Remember Us, tells the inspiring story of the liberation of a portion of the Netherlands from Nazi occupation. I tell it through the lives of 11 Americans, including Medal of Honor recipient Robert Cole, 101st Airborne, pilots, second lieutenants James and Edward Norton, twins who flew a B-26 Marauder together as part of the 322nd Bomb Group, Tanker Sergeant Bill Hughes, who was a radio man from the 784th Tank Battalion, Richie Boy Staff Sergeant Stephen Mossbacher, an interrogator with 8th Armored Division, Chaplain Captain Pat Folks, 17th Airborne, who earned his jump wings to be closer to his men, and Quartermaster Staff Sergeant Jeff Wiggins, 960th Quartermaster Service Company, assigned the horrible task of digging graves. But these American liberators are only part of the story. I also introduced two Dutch women, Frida, who was 19 years old, and Emily Michels van Kesnik, a mother of 11 children. Americans should know these women and the countless citizens of Limburg province who went to extraordinary lengths to honor fallen Americans through a grave adoption program. Throughout my research, I wanted to know what motivated the Dutch to honor foreigners in such a moving and lasting way. As the answers emerged, a second question came to mind. Why isn't there a grave adoption program of fallen Americans by Americans in our country? In 1942, when bombers of the mighty Eighth passed overhead, the Dutch cheered. When air crews bailed out of the burning planes, the Dutch hid those who made it and buried those who didn't. In September 1944, when soldiers of the 30th and 104th Infantry Divisions, Old Hickory and the Timberwolves, crossed the Belgian border into the Netherlands, and paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions dropped from the skies above Nijmegen and Eindhoven, they fell to their knees in gratitude. Even during the fight, the Dutch of Limburg province struggled with the question of how to thank their liberators when they were no longer alive to thank. The answer that emerged in January 1945 was a grave adoption program. Why would they do this? Like Frida and her family, they'd cared for these American boys and girls while they were alive. They'd helped dig the graves of those who were dead. Now they were determined to preserve their memory. By the first post-war Memorial Day, several hundred people around Margraten had volunteered to become adopters, visiting the fallen several times a year and placing flowers on their graves. A handful of them understood there was an even greater need across the ocean, inside American homes, where family members were grieving the loss of their loved ones. To reach them, Dutch adopters needed the names and addresses of the next of kin. When American officials refused to provide that information, Emily Michels van Kesnik penned a letter to President Harry Truman seeking help. She wrote, "Now that most of the Army has gone back to the States and only your fallen heroes remain in our soil, we want to establish a lasting tie between the relatives and our people." After asking the president to intercede, Emily concluded her letter with an impassioned plea. She said, "I'm the mother of 11 children, ranging from 14 years to 3 months. And if it should happen that my boys were buried in American soil, I should be so grateful if an American mother would send me a photograph and should go there sometimes in my place." Despite her moving letter, the War Department refused to budge. By the second post-war Memorial Day, every one of the 17,800 boys and a few women buried at the cemetery had a Dutch adopter. Every single one. More than 40,000 Dutch citizens attended that May 1946 ceremony at what had become the largest American World War II cemetery in Europe, a mass turnout that the New York Times characterized as being without parallel in a foreign country. 1 week later, frustrated that U.S. authorities steadfastly refused to provide the next of kin information, Emily made the courageous decision to leave her children and board a KLM flight, the very first airplane she'd ever flown on, to cross the Atlantic on a mission of mercy. For 5 weeks, she visited 24 different cities and towns in New England, Texas, and the Deep South. She spoke at 3 American Legion posts, sharing details of the grave adoption program. She stayed in the homes of families who had lost a loved one. She met with war widows young enough to be her daughters. She comforted other mothers who had suffered the worst loss imaginable. She absorbed their grief and left reassurance and grace in its place, telling all with whom she met, "Leave your boys with us. We'll watch over them like our own forever." Today, 80 years later, the Dutch have turned the Netherlands American Cemetery into a classroom filled with life. They take their children to the cemetery, especially their school kids. They gather in front of the gravestones to discuss an eternal truth. Freedom is not free. They tell their students the privilege of thinking what you want to think and saying what you want to say was purchased with the lives of the American men and women before you who had that privilege and gave it up. The Dutch grave adoption program is not the consequence of duty or obligation. It does not derive from the act of any one person. Rather, it's the consequence of making a commitment to remember by harnessing individual acts of kindness, gratitude, and love into one shared goal. Even amid the most lethal and destructive war in history, a transcendent moment of decency and humanity emerged. That's the story I tell in Remember Us. Now, if all I did was tell great stories, that'd be the end of my remarks, but it's not. I write books about the courage and nobility of men and women. There's always a higher purpose, a call to action that lifts our nation by honoring not only those who fought our wars and defended our freedom, but also their family members, the moms and dads, the sisters and brothers, wives, husbands, and children of our veterans, because they too have fought these battles. In 2007, I founded the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, a not-for-profit organization to pursue that higher purpose. Over the past 20 years, we have done much to honor the Monuments Men and Women for their service, including presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal. We've also continued their mission, locating and returning missing works of art to their rightful owners. We successfully persuaded the Army to reconstitute the monuments officers through the Army Monuments Officers Training Program. And most recently, we built the first permanent exhibition on the Monuments Men and Women through our partnership with the National World War II Museum. All that work continues, even while we have added a significant new project. In April, the Monuments Men and Women Foundation joined forces with the Dutch Foundation for Adopting Graves American Cemetery, Margraten. The name of our joint venture tells all, the Forever Promise Project. Today, there are 10,000 Americans buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery or whose names appear on the walls of the missing. Every state in the United States is represented, from the 113 sons of Alabama to the 16 sons of Wyoming. But the Dutch adopters only are in contact with 2,000 out of the 10,000 Americans buried at Margraten. We want to see that change. We're using the visibility of my book and events such as this to encourage Americans, to encourage you to visit the foreverpromise.org website, search the database of the 10,000 men and women at the Netherlands American Cemetery, and if you have a relative memorialized there, complete a short questionnaire that will enable our two foundations to connect the other 8,000 Dutch adopters to the American families. And I should add that yesterday we received an application to the Forever Promise website from someone in this room who notified us that they have a great uncle that's buried there. So that process has already begun as of yesterday. More than 250 Americans have already responded and asked to be connected to their Dutch adopters. Most had no idea the grave adoption program even existed. And we've received some incredibly touching messages from some of the people that have contacted us expressing their gratitude, including a 93-year-old lady in Texas whose brother is honored on the walls of the missing. She wrote to say this: "To know that someone will think of my brother and that he will never be forgotten is earth-shattering to me. I think of him every day, and knowing that I haven't a lot of time left, I am relieved that this young family will be there for his memory and my peace of mind." Now, this beautiful sentiment is not unique. It represents a universal truth. We all want to be remembered somehow, some way, by somebody. Once upon a time, our most important mentors, parents and grandparents who lived through the Depression and World War II, taught us by example about hardship, shared sacrifice, and the privilege of service to country. How can we fill the void created by the loss of such impactful teachers? How do we rebuild the connective tissue, as Tom Brokaw referred to it, that once existed between the men and women in uniform who serve our nation and those who derive the benefits from their service, especially in an era of an all-volunteer force? I believe the Dutch have provided us the answer: a grave adoption program of fallen Americans by Americans. The Monuments Men and Women Foundation wants to expand the Forever Promise Project by creating a grave adoption program for American service members killed in the service of their country who are buried in the United States. We want to build an army of young adopters to preserve the memory of our fallen of all wars. We want to use their stories, their legacy of service to the nation, to teach and inspire young Americans and fill that void created by the loss of the veterans and schools who once taught us. And we want to establish that same human connection and empathy between the young people of our nation and the family members of veterans who have lost a loved one. This is an ambitious project that will require partners and patience to customize the Forever Promise Project to our nation, just as the Dutch did for theirs. It is my hope that businesses and organizations of goodwill, especially the American Legion, will join us in this noble undertaking. What could be a more fitting tribute as we approach the 250th anniversary of our nation and its independence? A modern-day manifestation of the words of President Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, than honoring those who gave their lives that that nation might live. You here today who have earned that freedom, know that it is a daily, never-ending knife fight. It has always been that way. War shines a light on that reality. Peacetime breeds amnesia. General Eisenhower told us so 80 years ago when he wrote, "Volumes have been, and more volumes will be, written on the collapse of world cooperation and the true significance of the events that accompanied the tragedy. For us, all their words will amplify one simple truth: freedom from fear and injustice and oppression will be ours only in the measure that men who value such freedom are ready to sustain its possession, to defend against every thrust from within or without." I want to share with you a story from Remember Us about an American mother who, after the war, traveled to the Netherlands from Georgia on a quest to find her only son. She'd heard Emily Michels van Kesnick's appeal to mothers in Atlanta to leave their boys overseas, but she remained unbowed. Her boy was coming home. Once there, she met with the Dutch family who had sheltered him after his B-24 bomber was shot down. She visited the site a short distance from Apeldoorn, where Dutch resistance fighters had buried him after his torture and execution by the Gestapo. Wanting to honor her boy with a small memorial service before returning home, she published a notice in the newspaper inviting the townspeople to attend. The morning broke cold and rainy, not a ray of sun in the sky. And as she walked to the grave, she assumed a handful of people at best, maybe 3 or 4, would show up. She found 1,200 Dutch mourners gathered in the drizzling rain at her son's side. So many, she marveled, from so far away, carrying so much. As the minister closed the service, she fell to her knees there in the rain and the mud. She reached into her purse for a jar of red clay, red Georgia clay. She'd been planning to put it in the coffin for her son's journey home. Now she emptied the jar on the grave. She spread the clay gently, passing her hand back and forth as she'd rubbed her boy's back so many nights when he lay afraid or feverish as a child. She was leaving him, she'd decided, here among the Dutch, here among the people who appreciated his sacrifice and honored him and cared for him as well as any mother could. Many words have been written about soldiers in war, none more telling than those of American poet Archibald MacLeish. I want to close my remarks with his words as an expression of my gratitude for all of you and your families and all that you've given for the cause of freedom in our nation. The young dead soldiers do not speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They have a silence that speaks for them at night and when the clock counts. They say, "We were young. We have died. Remember us." They say, "We have done what we could, but until it is finished, it's not done." They say, "We have given our lives, but until it is finished, no one can know what our lives gave. They say our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make them. They say whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this. They say we leave you our deaths. Give them their meaning. Give them an end to the war and a true peace. Give them a victory that ends the war and a peace afterwards. Give them their meaning. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us. Thank you.